Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cerebrella. Today, we're stepping behind one of history's most overlooked figures, the woman who trained the woman who would go on to rule an empire. This is the true story of Ottoman princess Atike Sultan, told in her own voice, built from the fragments the historical record left behind. Get comfortable, and let's begin.
دستور شهزاده آتیک سلطان حضرتleri.
You have almost certainly never heard my name. If you know anything about the Ottoman court of the 17th century, you probably know my mother, Kösem Sultan, the most powerful woman ever to sit within the walls of Topkapi Palace, a woman whose name still fills history books and television screens 4 centuries later. You may even know the woman I raised with my own hands from childhood, Turhan Sultan, who went on to become one of the most consequential regents in Ottoman history. But me? I lived through the execution of one brother, the reign of a second brother remembered as one of the most ruthless sultans in Ottoman history, the reign and downfall of a third brother whose mind and rule both collapsed under the weight of the throne, and the rise of the nephew I helped shape into an emperor. I was married 3 times, buried 3 husbands, outlived nearly everyone I loved, and quietly held one of history's great secrets, that the woman who would one day rule the empire almost single-handedly, Turhan Sultan, learned everything she knew about power and survival from me, before she ever learned it from my mother. And yet, when historians write about the women of that era, my name is often reduced to a single line, a footnote beneath my mother's, beneath the woman I trained. Even the exact year of my birth is disputed. Even my own mother's identity has, at times, been questioned by historians working from incomplete records. I want to tell you what actually is known about my life, carefully, honestly, without inventing what the record doesn't support, because the gaps in my story are, in their own way, as revealing as the facts that survived. They tell you exactly whose stories get remembered by history, and whose get quietly left out. My name was Atike Sultan. This is what remains of my life. A childhood inside a dynasty at war with itself. I was born in Constantinople, inside the walls of Topkapi Palace, sometime around the year 1614. I want to be honest with you immediately about something historians still argue over even today. The exact date of my birth was never precisely recorded, which was not unusual for daughters of the Ottoman dynasty, whose births were documented with far less care than the births of their brothers. My father was Sultan Ahmed I, and my mother was Kösem Sultan, though I should tell you plainly that a small number of historians have questioned this over the years, given how incomplete the harem records of that period were. The version most historians accept, and the one I will tell you, is that I was Kösem Sultan's daughter, sister to 2 future sultans, Murad and Ibrahim, and half-sister to a third, Osman. I was only 3 years old when my father died in 1617. In the Ottoman court, the death of a sultan set off an immediate and often brutal reorganization of power, and even as a small child, I was swept into it. Along with my sisters, my half-sisters, my mother, and the other women who had borne my father's children, I was moved out of Topkapi Palace and into what was called the Old Palace, a separate residence in the city where the women and children of a deceased sultan's household were customarily sent once a new sultan took the throne. I do not remember much of those very early years myself, of course. No one does. But I grew up inside a palace complex that was, quite literally, a battlefield of ambition, even when no swords were drawn. And I did not have to wait long to understand exactly how dangerous that battlefield could be. The brother they strangled. My half-brother Osman became sultan as a teenager, and by the time I was old enough to understand what was happening around me, his reign had already become one of the most turbulent in recent Ottoman memory. Osman attempted sweeping military and institutional reforms, clashed repeatedly with the powerful Janissary Corps, and eventually, in 1622, was deposed and executed, strangled on the orders of the very soldiers who were supposed to protect the throne he sat on. I was around 8 years old when this happened. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I have thought about it many times across my own long life. An 8-year-old girl, growing up inside the same palace walls where her half-brother's execution had just taken place, learning far too early exactly what could happen to members of my own family when the machinery of the empire turned against them. This was the world I grew up inside. Not a fairy tale of jeweled thrones and silk gowns, though there was plenty of that too. A world where power could turn violently, without warning, against people who shared my own blood. My brother Murad eventually took the throne in 1623, when I was still a young girl. He would go on to rule for nearly 2 decades, remembered by history as one of the most ruthless and effective Ottoman sultans of the era. A man who reasserted central authority over the empire through what many historians describe as extreme severity, including, according to widely cited accounts, the execution of his own brother Ibrahim's rivals to secure the succession, and a broader reputation for brutal punishment of dissent throughout his reign. I do not have detailed personal records of my relationship with Murad during those years. The surviving documentation of my life, like that of most Ottoman princesses, focuses far more on my marriages and my stipends than on my personal relationships with my siblings. What I can tell you, factually, is that I lived through his entire reign, watched the empire operate under his particular brand of iron control, and by 1639, the year my brother Murad still sat on the throne, the official court records show I was receiving a daily stipend of 330 aspers, a detail that survives specifically because Ottoman treasury records were kept with far more precision than records of personal relationships ever were. Marriage, politics, and the business of survival. In 1633, during my brother Murad's reign, I was married for the first time to a statesman named Musahip Jafar Pasha. Marriage for an Ottoman princess of my rank was never a private matter. It was, fundamentally, a political tool, a way of binding capable statesmen more tightly to the dynasty by making them sons-in-law of the royal house. I want to be honest about that reality, rather than romanticize it. My marriages were arranged for reasons of state, not sentiment, as was true for nearly every woman of my position in that era. Jafar Pasha died in 1647. I do not know from the surviving record what my personal grief looked like in that moment, because no one thought to write it down. What the record does show is what happened next, because that part mattered to the machinery of the empire. In 1648, I was married a second time, to a statesman named Kenan Pasha. That same year, 1648, was one of the most violent turning points in my family's entire history. My brother, Ibrahim, the Sultan by that point, a man whose difficult early life in confinement had left him deeply unstable, was deposed and strangled, exactly as our half-brother Osman had been a generation before. I had now lived through the execution of two brothers who had each, in turn, sat on the Ottoman throne. If you are keeping count, that is not a metaphor. That is simply the arithmetic of my life. My nephew, Ibrahim's young son, Mehmed, was placed on the throne as a child of 7, and it was in the years immediately following this that my own quiet, mostly undocumented role in Ottoman history reached its most significant point, a role that survives today largely because of a single crucial detail recorded by later historians. The girl I trained. Some years before all of this, a young captive girl had been brought into my household, a girl taken, most likely, in one of the regular slave raids that supplied the Ottoman court, delivered to the palace by an Ottoman commander. I took her in, and by the account that survives in the historical record, I personally trained her in etiquette, in the customs of the court, in the particular dangerous art of surviving inside a palace where the wrong misstep could cost a person everything. Her name was Turhan. When she came of age, it was I who gave her, as a gift, to my mother, Kösem Sultan, the customary way such women were formally introduced deeper into the palace hierarchy. Turhan went on to be presented to my brother Ibrahim, and in 1642, she gave birth to my nephew, the boy who would become Sultan Mehmed IV. I did not stop my involvement there. According to the historical record, I continued to care for both Turhan and, later, her infant son Mehmed so closely and so consistently that both of them referred to me as their governess, and I was regarded, in practical terms, as something like a second mother to Turhan and a grandmother figure to young Mehmed himself. I want you to understand what this means, because it rarely gets said plainly. The woman who would go on to become one of the most powerful regents in the entire history of the Ottoman Empire, who would outmaneuver my own formidable mother in a bitter 3-year struggle for the regency, who would go on to govern the empire for over 3 decades, learned the foundations of court survival first from me. History remembers Kösem Sultan's role in Turhan's rise. It remembers, in vivid and often dramatic detail, the deadly rivalry that eventually developed between my mother and the woman I had once personally trained. It remembers far less about the years before any of that rivalry existed, the years when it was simply my hands guiding a frightened, displaced young girl through the unfamiliar and dangerous customs of the world she'd been thrown into. I was there first. The record confirms it, even if the storytellers rarely dwell on it. The years of quiet survival. In 1652, my second husband, Kenan Pasha, died. That same year, I was married a third and final time to a statesman named Dawanji Yusuf Pasha. He would remain my husband for 18 years, until his own death in 1670. 3 marriages, 3 husbands, each a prominent statesman of the empire. Each marriage arranged for reasons that had far more to do with binding loyal men to the royal house than with anything resembling romantic choice on my part. This was simply the shape that survival took for a woman of my position. Not powerlessness, exactly, because Ottoman princesses often held real economic and social influence through these arrangements, but a very particular, very constrained kind of agency, exercised entirely within boundaries I did not set myself. I lived through the entirety of my mother's extraordinary, dangerous political career, including, in 1651, her death, killed inside the palace during the very struggle for power that pitted her against the woman I had once trained with my own hands. I do not have a surviving record of what I felt watching that particular chapter of my family's history unfold. My mother and my adopted protege locked in a fight that only one of them would survive. If I wrote my thoughts down anywhere, they have not come down to us. What I can tell you, because the record confirms it plainly, is that I continued on. I outlived my mother. I outlived 3 husbands. I continued receiving my stipend, continued my role as a senior, respected woman of the dynasty. And in 1683, remarkably late in my own long life, I commissioned a public fountain between the districts of Salajak and Doğancılar in Istanbul, a modest but permanent act of civic patronage, the kind many wealthy Ottoman women engaged in as a way of leaving something behind that would outlast them. There is one more detail I want you to know, because it says something true about who I was, even in a life defined mostly by the ambitions of others. Later in my life, I became what the historical record calls the spiritual mother of a young man named Minya, a former prince of Wallachia who came to live in Constantinople. I cared for him as an adoptive son during his time in the city. One more example, alongside my care for Turhan and young Mehmed, of a pattern that seems to run quietly through my entire life. I was, again and again, chosen, not for power in my own name, but for the particular skill of raising and steadying people who would go on to hold power far greater than mine. I died sometime around the year 1674 in Constantinople, the same city where I had been born roughly 6 decades earlier. I was buried in my brother Ibrahim's mausoleum inside Hagia Sophia, resting, even in death, beside the family whose turbulent, often violent history I had witnessed almost in its entirety, from the execution of one brother when I was a child to the strangling of another when I was already a grown woman, to the rise of a nephew I had helped raise from infancy. I want to be honest with you about something as I close this story. Much of what I've told you tonight represents nearly the complete surviving historical record of my life. Unlike my mother, whose political maneuvering filled the accounts of ambassadors and court chroniclers, or Turhan, whose 3-decade regency generated its own substantial documentation, my own life survives mostly in fragments. A marriage date here, a stipend figure there, a single sentence noting that I trained the woman who would eventually help run an empire. I have thought, across the long span of whatever awareness lingers after a life like mine, about why that is. Perhaps it's simply because I never held formal political power in my own name. I was never a Valide Sultan, never a regent, never the woman signing decrees from behind the lattice screen. I was, instead, something quieter, and I think no less essential. The woman who trained the women who did. History tends to remember the names on the thrones and the names beside them. It remembers far less often the names of the women who did the patient, unglamorous work of preparing the next generation for the storms they were about to walk into. I was one of those women. If you remember one thing about me, let it be this. Before Turhan Sultan ever became one of the most powerful regents in Ottoman history, before she ever outmaneuvered my own formidable mother, she was a frightened, displaced girl who needed someone to teach her how to survive inside a palace built on ambition and blood. That someone was me. That was the story of Atike Sultan, the quiet hand behind one of history's most powerful regents. If you enjoyed uncovering a story history almost forgot, hit subscribe for more true stories from the past, told the way they deserve to be told. Thank you for listening.